Chapter 1. Haiti. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. John F. Kennedy. As the plane descended, I could not help but feel insane for coming here. Even from the air, Haiti reeks with despair. Throughout the rural areas, I could see makeshift huts that housed a dozen people. There were fallow fields and denuded mountains, ravaged by hungry peasants trying to cultivate unarable land. Over Port-au-Prince, the huge slums came into view. It was not until I landed that the blunt reality hit me. Nothing could have prepared me for the abject poverty and the stark contrasts I saw. The slides, the pictures, the talks, the magazine articles only intimated what it was really like. Now I saw it in glorious 3 dimensions, complete with sound and smell. I was thrust into the worst living conditions in the Western Hemisphere, the slums of Port-au-Prince. I visited the largest Cité Simone, named after the mother of the former president for life. Thousands upon thousands of unemployed rural peasants have crammed into this area. Occasional fires roar through, leaving many homeless. Around the periphery of the city, new slums are burgeoning. Some have been named after American cities such as Brooklyn and Boston. In the past 10 years, the population of Port-au-Prince has doubled to over 1 million. These slums spawn a multitude of disease-infested human beings, my patients. Housing consists of shacks, smaller than a college dormitory room, made of wooden sticks with a hodgepodge of foliage, mud, animal dung, and cardboard. Sheets of corrugated tin serve as roofs, even though most have rust-eroded holes. A well-placed kick could easily flatten one. The better shacks also have metal sheets as siding, and luxury complexes have cement bricks. The floors are coarse dirt and because overcrowding, the occupants sleep in shifts. Naturally, there is no privacy, and sex education in Haiti is by observation. The main theme in this college of despair is the conservation of space. Clotheslines are suspended between the shacks that appear incapable of supporting anything, lest the shacks be pulled down. Pans, kettles, and shovels are stored on the rooftops. Garbage is heaped up at the entrances, spewing into the narrow streets along with human excrement, orange and banana peels, scraps of sharp metal, cans, and broken glass embedded in the mud. Puddles of stagnant water coalesce, forming a stream, the sewage system. The slowly oozing water is covered by a thick brown reflective film, occasionally pierced with proliferating green algae. It is quite popular with the flies. Emanating from it comes a hideous stench, a combination of excrement and decaying fruit fermenting in the 100-degree sun. The most striking feature, though, is the masses of people, over 100,000 squashed in a square mile with one-story housing. Haiti is the most densely populated country in the Western Hemisphere, averaging 700 people per square mile as opposed to 50 in Nicaragua or 60 in the United States. The Haitians are busy surviving. Everyone is hustling, jammed into the narrow streets, performing the necessary chores of pre-industrial society. The women, dressed in colorful ankle-length skirts and matching t-shirts, are carrying buckets of water, baskets of fruit, or piles of clothing on their heads. Frequently, they are followed by a miniature, their daughter, doing the same. This method of transporting goods requires tremendous balance and coordination and is learned at an early age. These women are able to stop, turn their heads, and even walk upstairs with 60-pound loads on their heads. It gives them stately posture and a buoyant lilt that accentuates their well-proportioned frames. It also gives them intense neck and back pain, a problem I would frequently treat. Many women congregate around a large block with protruding pipes, the water source. Naked children abound with their shiny pot bellies, stick legs, and red hair, a sign of malnutrition. Upon seeing me, they run up yelling, "Blanc, blanc," some with outstretched hands asking for money, but most just curious to get a closer look at me. To the uninitiated, being called a blanc, or white, seems insulting, but in actuality the term is reserved for foreigners, including American blacks. When I mastered Creole, I became a neg, one of the guys. Unlike the women, not all the men are working. Sex roles are well defined, and some would rather sit idly than carry water or cook. Most are hustling, though. Shirtless in the brutal sun, wearing dull pants and laceless torn shoes, they pull carts with loaded cement bags or charcoal, Haiti's main source of energy. This toil results in elegantly sculpted torsos that no Nautilus machine could produce. Amidst this activity are meatless animals, chickens, goats, and dogs. Pigs, once Haiti's main scavenger, are conspicuously absent. They have been eradicated because some harbored African swine flu. The program ostensibly was to help Haiti, but in actuality was conceived to prevent the virus from spreading to the United States and endangering the multi-billion-dollar pork industry. As if this were not enough sensory overload, a white Mazda suddenly invades the street. An upper-class Haitian is driving, and he obnoxiously blasts his horn while accelerating. The women grab their produce and children, rapidly dispersing as the juggernaut speeds towards them. No one casts defiant glares, but merely accepts this behavior as the right of the gros nègre, the big shot. Malheur pas jamais gain raison devant gros nègre. The poor man has no rights before the big shot. Walking towards central Port-au-Prince, I came to a market, the hub of the peasant economy, where rural peasants sell their produce. The vendors are mostly women. They begin their trek early, arriving at daybreak, selling and bartering until dusk. Since marketing is also an important social event, a woman will not sell all her produce early in the day, even if offered twice its value. Each vendor squats in carefully mapped out territory, her colorful skirt draped between her legs, protecting her modesty. Huge broad-brimmed hats shield them from the sun. Much of the attire is outmoded American clothing, bell-bottoms, wide belts, and paisley shirts. The Haitians call themselves Kennedys, after the American president, who increased humanitarian aid to their country while surreptitiously attempting to overthrow its government. All one needs to survive is here: mangoes, avocados, sugarcane, cornmeal, rice, meat, soap, clothing, and linen. Many potential customers are milling about, but it looks as if everyone is selling, but nobody is buying. The vendors have a low-key, soft-sell approach for their fickle and impecunious customers. My presence changes this. With huge smiles, the vendors hold up their wares. To them, I am a blanc bête, or stupid white, who pays 4 times the going price of an avocado, which is still 1/3 the price in the United States. After learning Creole, I became a blanchite, or cheap white, who insisted on paying the same price as the Haitians. While scanning this scene, my eyes meet those of a woman who has 5 large baskets stacked on her head. Thinking of me as a customer rather than a curious onlooker, she stops by thrusting her hips forward and stopping them while letting her upper body gradually recoil forward in a serpentine fashion, absorbing the movement of the baskets. When she raises her eyebrows towards her wares, I nod my head with the universal no. Grimacing, she repeats her serpentine movement and continues. I was then taken to Saint-Fille, the hospital for the adults where I would be working. Saint-Fille once belonged to the Jesuits, until the government exiled them for fomenting insurrection. It is a large, bleak, white 2-story building which houses men on the first floor and women on the second. Each floor consists of 2 rooms, one for tuberculosis patients and the other for those with other chronic diseases. A large patio attached to the facade at a right angle serves as a place to distribute food, so those waiting do not have to stand in the sun. Here are housed the poorest of the poor, the forgotten, the neglected, the abused. They have no home, no family, and no representation. Many have been found lying in the streets. Others were involved in automobile accidents and could not pay for care. Some were refused admission to a hospital and just left to die. Of the 150 human beings here, most are nursed back to health, but many die. Some just need a bath and food, but others have tuberculosis, diarrhea, and a variety of tropical diseases. An impending gloom hangs over the place. There is a stench that is a combination of human excrement and disinfectant. Cactic men in green scrub suits lie on the small concrete porch, lazily swatting attacking flies. Inside are rows of metal bed frames, each with a rotting mattress and vinyl sheets. Underneath are soiled plastic bedpans and urinals. Those with intractable coughs also have cuspidors. As I walk in, to my left is a contorted but smiling young man with a pink rosary around his neck, quadriplegic from polio. Several men are dying. They have no muscle mass, just sagging flesh attached to bone. Their cheeks are hollow with stubble of an unshaven beard sticking out of their pale black faces. Their heads look like skulls, as if they have already begun to decompose. They have no energy to swat the multitude of flies that crawl on them with impunity. Others lie asleep with their genitals exposed, revealing an ulcerated penis or swollen groin glands, the result of neglected venereal disease. Overlooking the rooms are pictures of Jesus Christ. As he gazes at this, he is probably glad that someone is caring for the least of my brethren, but he also realizes that his message of 2,000 years ago has been greatly distorted in this country, whose official religion is Roman Catholic. Still reeling from culture shock, I was taken by Dr. Demers on a visit to the palatial home of an elite family. The Pierres live in Pétionville, a suburb of Port-au-Prince, which has the highest density of millionaires in the Caribbean. The Pierres' house is set back amidst a well-cultivated arboretum, complete with a palm tree-lined driveway and manicured flower bed encircling a spacious stone patio. A Mercedes, a 1930s roadster, and assorted sports cars clutter the driveway. The house is even more ostentatious. It is split level with an inlaid marble floor covered with Persian rugs. The posh furniture is complemented by cubist paintings, all crowned by an ornate crystal chandelier. Mr. Pierre, a well-built, balding man in his 50s, greeted me. Fashionably attired in a blue leisure suit and with gold chains intertwined amongst the thick gray hair of his exposed chest, he looked like the owner of a pornographic magazine. His wife, a svelte woman of 45, was stunning in her full-length azure dress. They are mulattoes, the 2% of Haiti which has retained economic power for generations no matter who has ruled. Gracious host, the Pierres deferred to my ignorance and prevented the conversation from lapsing into French, Haiti's official language, until 1987. Only a small percentage of the Haitians actually speak it. To the vast majority, Creole is the only language. During my stay in Haiti, most Haitians I met could not speak French, but I never met one who could not speak Creole. It was formed by the slaves who combined their African tongues with Norman French. Initially, Creole seems limited with its simple grammar and small vocabulary, but one can express most of the nuances of English with it. Moreover, imaginative words have recently been created. For example, the word for copy is zewok, razor is gillette, and penile erection is Pinocchio. The existence of the Creole language is an insult to Mr. Pierre. He considers it to be disrespectful if his children speak it in his presence. Creole represents a bastardization of French and therefore of French culture, the measure of status to the elite. To the masses, Creole is a source of pride, and there is continual conflict whether French or Creole should be taught in the school. This proverb personifies the struggle. Parler français, pas dit l'esprit pour ça. Just speaking French doesn't mean one can think. Between sips of Chablis, Mr. Pierre told me about himself. His elite status is assured by a family-controlled franchise on pharmaceuticals imported to Haiti. However, he was bored with this sinecure and preferred to discuss his social life, his donations to the Michel Duvalier Foundation, the latest society ball, and his recent trip to Paris. Mr. Pierre buys his clothes in New York, but his shoes in Paris. With unabashed pretentiousness, he explained in fluent English that, unlike the nouveau riche, he never paid full price when shopping. Old money gives one influential connections. He had no interest whatsoever in the plight of the poor. Lazy, listless, and without ambition, they deserved their fate. They were born to serve. He resented American meddling. We had no business complaining about human rights abuses or rigged elections. Haiti needed no external interferences, and he proudly told me of how Papa Doc rebuffed an American ambassador who had tried to dictate Haitian policy. He felt the political repression could continue with impunity because of Haiti's proximity to Cuba and the questionable status of an American military base in Guantanamo Bay, whose lease expires in 1999. Mr. Pierre is typical of the elite. Superficially, they are likable, always thanking me for helping their poor countrymen, inviting me to dinner, and speaking of progress in Haiti. Beneath this genteel veneer, they are devoid of compassion. They live a life of leisure, decadence, and social posturing. Cultured, multilingual, and well-mannered, they have no intention of bucking the system that protects their current existence. They receive their education in Paris or the United States and spend their summers on Haiti's beautiful beaches. One wealthy Haitian, when I queried why more was not being done to help the poor, responded, "That's what you're here for." The deep dichotomy in Haitian society is well entrenched in its history. In one form or another, there have always been masters and slaves. The peasant was never paid fairly, whether a slave to French overlords or a laborer under the black and mulatto elites. The island of Hispaniola was first colonized by the Spanish, whose forced labor made short work of the native Indians. Consequently, a new labor force was found, Africans. The opportunistic French also claimed territory on Hispaniola, and in the late 17th century, Spain ceded possession of the western third of the island to France. Thus was formed Haiti. With its tropical climate and fertile soil, anything grew. Sugar, coffee, cotton, bananas, sisal, and indigo all made Haiti more productive than the entire English 13 colonies. However, the slave owners presided with unprecedented brutality. The slaves, many being members of warrior tribes, were not docile. They did not wait for the raising of the white man's consciousness, and their frequent revolts were suppressed with a sadistic barbarism that could neither be forgotten nor forgiven. Perpetrators were buried with only their honey-covered faces and genitals exposed and left to die amid feasting ants. Others were publicly blown apart by gunpowder packed in their rectums. The owners took the most desirable women, forming a third class, the mulattoes. The blacks, whites, and the mulattoes engaged in a complex political and military struggle that culminated in Haiti's becoming the first black republic. Two men dominated the action, Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Inspiring a fanatical devotion that harbored on deification, these former slaves commanded the guerrilla warfare that vanquished the superiorly armed French. While the French defeat is often ascribed to disease, they were actually outsmarted by the Haitian generals as their colonial forays into other tropical climates had been successful. Louverture and Dessalines actually planned biological warfare, burning their own towns and retreating, waiting to mount their offensive during the rainy seasons, when malaria, typhoid, and yellow fever would decimate the ill-equipped Caucasian immune system. Thus ended Napoleon's dream of conquering North America. Without a base to protect the Louisiana Territory, he was forced to sell it to the nascent United States. By feigning a peace conference, the French captured Louverture, and during his confinement he died. Dessalines did not succumb to the French platitudes, knowing their main goal was to restore the slavery that still existed on Martinique and Guadeloupe. He offered amnesty to all whites in Haiti. When they came out of hiding, they were massacred, all 20,000 of them, forever ridding Haiti of the specter of slavery. Grabbing the French tricolor flag, he ripped out the white middle, forming Haiti's flag and proclaiming the Republic in 1804. What remained was a war-ravaged Haiti, isolated from the international community and with no economic infrastructure. Only the mulattoes were left to communicate with the outside world and to revitalize Haiti. It never happened. The black military elite and mulattoes fought for the prime land. Meanwhile, the peasant continued to be exploited. Forced labor was reinstituted. So many escaped to the countryside, becoming squatters. They just wanted to be left alone, to practice their religion, raise their families, and enjoy life. During the subsequent century, internecine political infighting stunted economic growth. Foreign business recolonized Haiti, controlling its banks and commerce while raping its treasury with false indemnities. When the Haitians objected, the gunboats arrived. The effete governments were unable to prevent rioting, looting, and open warfare. Anarchy prevailed. In 1915, the U.S. Marines landed. While they were ostensibly to restore order, their real job was to protect American business interests while preventing the Germans, who also had interests in Haiti, from establishing a military base. The Americans ended the chaos and built schools, roads, and hospitals. However, a bloated bureaucracy sapped the treasury. Favoritism towards the mulattoes encouraged resentment. More important, the Haitians were stripped of their dignity. The proud people who shattered the yoke of slavery were forced to tolerate Southern rednecks that refused to shake their hands. These interlopers displayed a disdain for Haitian culture, refusing to learn either Creole or French. Terrorist attacks by a peasant underground, the Cacos, along with eloquent protests from the elite, forced an American withdrawal. By 1934, the military presence ended with the hope that Haiti could establish representative government. It never happened. The mulatto and black elite, previously united in their assault on American occupation, soon returned to their senseless squabbling. The roads decayed, the plumbing rotted, and the telephones stopped working. Within 2 decades, Haiti was again in anarchy. In 1956 and 1957, there were 6 presidents, all trying to appease a greedy elite and power-hungry military. It was an impossible and uncontrollable situation. In 1957, a country doctor and leader of the emerging black middle class was elected president. François Duvalier was considered dull and pliable by both supporters and opponents. He tolerated insults to his face, always smiling and laughing them off. Haiti's power brokers had another pawn that would obsequiously patronize them. Behind his mindless smile, however, Duvalier plotted his ascendancy. Having been in a former president's cabinet, he knew that vacillation and appeasement only sealed one's doom. He understood that to have power in Haiti, one had to balance the military. Thus were created the Tonton Macoutes, his secret police. They were from his constituency and received no official salary, only what they could extort, confiscate, or steal. A strange thing began to happen. Duvalier's opponents simply disappeared. Before the elite had realized what had happened, Duvalier was untouchable. The Tonton Macoutes terrorized the country, sneaking into people's homes at night, killing them and disposing of their bodies. The prisons swelled and torture became commonplace. The affable smile turned to an icy stare, and Duvalier tormented his supporters as much as his opponents, threatening a pile of bodies as high as the Himalayas. Duvalier, or Papa Doc, then declared himself president for life. Although he survived coup attempts and American-backed invasions, Papa Doc encountered one enemy he could not vanquish: heart failure. In 1971, he succumbed, but not before naming a successor, his 19-year-old son, Jean-Claude Duvalier. During Papa Doc's reign of terror, foreign investment dwindled, tourism stopped, and many elite and middle-class professionals emigrated. Haiti now had political stability, but its economy disintegrated. Baby Doc relaxed his father's repression. The Tonton Macoutes started beating people rather than killing them. Tourism blossomed, and the foreign investments returned. Baby Doc married a beautiful mulatto divorcee, Michelle Bennett, uniting the warring black bureaucracy and military with the mulatto elite. Michelle was Haiti's version of Evita Peron. Haiti, with its industrious workforce, political stability, and pleasant climate, was poised to become the Taiwan of the Caribbean. Unfortunately, the bureaucrats and investors only helped themselves, taking advantage of industrious peasants. Cheap labor was used to produce export items rather than develop an economy that would sustain a steady growth. The most fertile area, the Artibonite Valley, was partially flooded to provide hydroelectric power to foreign investors, robbing many peasants of their agrarian livelihood. On paper, economic growth appeared. During the 1970s, Haiti's gross national product rose annually. Unfortunately, 50% of the income went to less than 1% of the population. Meanwhile, the vast majority were making less than $140 per year. The poor were heavily taxed for their products, forcing them to sell at low prices to the tax-exempt, politically powerful. Corporations who had their markets overseas were not concerned, as they were still making a profit. During this time, an ominous condition was developing. The population of Haiti doubled in only 30 years. In order to feed themselves, the peasants cultivated the mountains, cutting down the trees that protected the soil. Now most of Haiti's topsoil has been forever lost to the rivers that become mud with each rainfall. Many peasants moved into the cities, especially into Port-au-Prince, where unemployment is at nearly 50%. Since many were starving and ill, the international community increased aid to Haiti via direct grants and bank loans. Most of it simply vanished. Canada, when $20 million of its aid was stolen, refused to send any more, dubbing Haiti a kleptocracy. The International Monetary Fund reluctantly agreed to continue loans to Haiti, but stipulated that the money be monitored by its representative, Marc Bazin. A native Haitian, Bazin quickly spotted accounting irregularities as money was transferred amongst Haiti's financial institutions. There was no apparent attempt to hide the theft in taxes or finance charges. The money was simply stolen. Bazin also suggested that export taxes be paid equally by all. In Haiti, he who controls the export taxes controls the country. High taxes force the peasant to sell their products, especially coffee, to political cronies who are naturally tax exempt. Within 5 months, Bazin was ejected from Haiti. All warring factions agreed not to tolerate anyone who hindered their graft. Private organizations working in Haiti also encountered financial difficulties. The government insisted that all money be placed in the Bank of Haiti. This hoarding of American dollars has allowed Haiti to print on its currency 5 gourds equal $1 since 1919, making the gourd impervious to the vicissitudes of international exchange. Many organizations refused and instead increased importing material goods. The Haitian government was not to be outsmarted. It simply assessed the value of the food and put a huge tax on it. It is now routine for food, farming equipment, and medical supplies to sit in customs for years until the property entry taxes are paid. The Ethiopian government used the same technique with great success to fill its coffers. Food being shipped to feed the starving was outrageously taxed, and the guilt-ridden industrial world anteed up. In the early 1980s, Haiti was pummeled by forces beyond its control. Since it was dependent on export income, the world recession diminished the industrialized world's interest in Haiti's products. Hurricanes destroyed its cash crops, especially coffee, considered in some circles to be the best in the world. Haiti's tourist industry had been foundering since the mid-70s. The beggars of Port-au-Prince constantly harassed vacationers. The cruise ships started to bypass Haiti and continued directly to Jamaica. However, it was a report from the Center of Disease Control in Atlanta that was the death knell. It described a new disease, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, and cited 4 high-risk groups: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, drug addicts, and Haitians. As the hysteria increased, tourism came to a standstill. The hotels emptied, the roulette wheels stopped, and the boutiques closed down. Haitians were eventually removed from the high-risk category, but the damage had already been done. Now only missionaries and idealists visit. Haiti has sunk from pessimism to frank despair. There are simply no jobs. Even foreign investors, spurred by a $3 daily minimum wage, provide jobs for only 6% of the workforce. Men are sold by the government at $3 a head to the neighboring Dominican Republic to cut the sugarcane crop. No one else is willing to swing a machete for 10 hours in 100-degree heat for $1.50 a day. From this meager wage they must pay for room and board, shanties and crumbs. The owners munificently extend credit so that after 3 months of hard work, many laborers actually owe money. Those who complain are beaten. This indentured slavery filled the coffers of the American-based multinational corporation that owned the sugarcane fields until the late 1980s, Gulf and Western. Although patriotic, the Haitians are desperate. They are willing to risk anything, including their lives, to leave. Those who could have built a new Haiti, the incipient middle class, have fled and live in France, Canada, and the United States. Entire families pool their resources so that one member can emigrate. They must endure endless lines, hassles with bureaucracy, and thievery by travel agents. But in the end, they are rewarded. Haitians quickly achieve a life in the United States they could never dream of in Haiti. With the money they send back, more family members are able to emigrate. For most of the poor, though, obtaining a passport, visa, and airline ticket is a distant dream. Those who decide to leave jam onto dilapidated boats and begin a dangerous odyssey north. As one Haitian put it, the teeth of the shark are sweeter than Duvalier's hell. The boat leaves at night and 12 hours later arrives at a beach where scantily clad whites are windsurfing and playing volleyball. They have finally arrived in America, the land of opportunity. Triumphantly disembarking, they soon encounter blacks who, strangely, speak Creole. Then comes the shocking realization. After saving their money for 2 years, they have been deposited at Haiti's Club Med. Even those who are on course have no guarantees. Their boats, wooden platforms with makeshift sails, frequently capsize, making headlines in Miami when their bodies wash up on the beach. Others are preyed upon by Cuban pirates. Also, the smugglers overload a boat to maximize profits, then randomly throw people overboard. Those who miraculously arrive, sunstroked and dehydrated, are not greeted with open arms. They are immediately placed in detention centers where they languish in legal limbo until the courts decide their fate. The American government argues that they are fleeing poverty and not repression and should not be granted political asylum. However, since the Haitian government considers fleeing the country to be treason, those returned are often beaten and imprisoned. Because Haiti is not a communist country, most courts have refused to release detained Haitians. Some have become so depressed that they commit suicide, something they rarely do in their own country. To prevent further court battles, the Coast Guard began to patrol international waters to seize fleeing Haitians so they can be returned to Haiti without due process. In spite of these numerous obstacles, there are almost 1 million Haitians living in the United States. Many arrived illiterate, penniless, and unable to speak English. They suffered discrimination, culture shock, and imprisonment. The AIDS hysteria has made them pariahs. Since many are illegal aliens, employers exploit them, paying them much less than the minimum wage and denying benefits. Security deposits are not refunded on apartments. Nonetheless, they remain surprisingly optimistic. Most Haitians learn English within 6 months. Education is revered, and 90% of teenage Haitians attend high school. They do not have the 9-to-5 concept and are willing to work long hours. Violent crime against non-Haitians is virtually unheard of. The percentage of those on public assistance is no higher than that of the general population. The Haitians, while keeping a low profile, have proven they can do well if only given a chance. The Duvalier government had no intention of giving native Haitians a chance. While Michel Duvalier created an overly air-conditioned room so that the elite women could wear furs to parties, the government controlled the bleak situation by censorship, intimidation, and torture. Every morning the propaganda trucks rode through Port-au-Prince, stroking national pride by reminding them of their conquest over slavery. The Tonton Macoutes, now renamed the Volunteers for National Security, pervaded all aspects of life, quelling dissent. Attempts by laborers to unionize were quickly crushed. Nonetheless, the writing was on the wall. The situation was intolerable and simply could not last. Sporadic rebellions began. In 1984, food riots started in Gonaïves, a city in central Haiti. While many were so hungry they were killing their dogs, a warehouse filled with food donated by CARE was locked. Local government officials were demanding payment for it. When opposition formed, the Tonton Macoutes killed the leader and beat his pregnant wife. The ensuing outrage overwhelmed local authorities, and Duvalier dispatched the army. They quickly quelled the riots with characteristic savagery. Nobody ever received any food. Organized dissent began also, most of it led by the Catholic Church. This was a reversal of its previous role, in which it formed an alliance with the oligarchy and the military. Until recently, all major clerical appointments from the Vatican had to receive government approval. This medieval arrangement bonded the church and state politically. To this day, prominent church officials live in huge mansions with guard dogs, and the elite send their children to the best Catholic prep schools. With Vatican II, Catholicism began to appeal more to the masses. It has always been the official religion, but the religion of the people is voodoo, an African creed in which spirits of Loas pervade every aspect of life. The ceremonies, with their lascivious dances, spiritual possession, and decapitated chickens, make it a must for tourists. However, these displays mask a complex religion that is poorly understood by non-Haitians. The Ongans, or priests, are articulate and educated community leaders who do not try to compete with Catholicism, but wisely incorporate it. The Latin Mass, with its little action, bored the peasants. However, with Vatican II, the people could use the vernacular Creole, dance and play bongo drums. With this increased bond to the people, the church became their advocate. Radio Soleil, the Catholic radio station, politely derided the government. However, it was the Pope's visit in 1983 that increased church activism. In front of tens of thousands of people, with Duvalier beside him, the Pope spoke forcefully about the deep need for justice in Haitian society. Unlike his approach in Central America, the Pope's policy endorsed clerical militancy in Haiti. His very presence was contingent upon the repeal of the policy of government approval for prominent church positions. The newspapers were censored, so the Pope's speech was never published. Mr. Bennett, President Duvalier's father-in-law, wrote a scathing rebuttal implying a possible repeat of the assassination of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador if clerical opposition continued. Nonetheless, as a violent response to conscientious clerics invites the reproach of the industrialized world, the Haitian government was gradually being forced into tolerating open disagreement from the clergy, whether they liked it or not. While Haiti paid lip service to American overtures about democracy, their elections were a sham. When Baby Doc ran for re-election for president for life in 1985, he received 1,300,000 votes. There was one dissenter. Elections to the 59-member National Assembly were equally farcical. Serious opposition candidates were not permitted on the ballot. Even so, since the president had veto power over this rubber-stamp parliament, elections were academic. Haiti truly had a one-man, one-vote system. The president was the only one who voted, and his word was law. Democracy was simply a game, the prize being American dollars. Though it appeared that Haiti's totalitarian government at least provided political stability, it was the mass exodus of the up-and-coming that had prevented violent revolution. The Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Quebec, France, and especially the United States acted as a safety valve. Only Port-au-Prince has more Haitians than New York City, and the third largest concentration is in Miami. When it became more difficult for Haitians to enter the United States, the safety valve was plugged. Even recent medical school graduates could not find American residencies, and the Haitian government was forced to decrease its medical school enrollment by 50%. Not only the poor, but now the up-and-coming, had no place to go. Early in 1986, the riots started again with a renewed vigor that even the random butchery of the Tonton Macoutes could not stop. The government closed Radio Soleil and 2 other church stations, but soon rumors abounded that the fall of the Duvalier dynasty was imminent. Jean-Claude Duvalier, to prove he was in control, drove through Port-au-Prince in his Mercedes and proclaimed his authority was as firmly attached as a monkey's tail. Meanwhile, Haitian diplomats, protected from searches by international law, absconded from Haiti with suitcases full of money. Several days later, the Duvalier family and several political cronies boarded an American military jet destined for France. The same man who 6 months prior had received over 99% of the vote escaped with an estimated fortune of $500 million. The Duvalier dynasty had ended. While Jean-Claude was complaining in his 4-star French hotel that he could not get lobster for breakfast, the cumulative rage of almost 3 decades of repression spilled onto the streets of Haiti. Members of the Tonton Macoutes were killed and dismembered while their houses burned. Shops were looted, and the large mausoleum of Papa Doc was desecrated. Only the foresight of Jean-Claude in taking his father's remains prevented their being scattered on the streets of Port-au-Prince. The posters of Jean-Claude with his Gucci-laden wife that littered public places were torn down and urinated upon. Haiti is now governed by a junta of military and civilian leaders who are promising democratic elections. Some pundits are optimistic, while others see the departure of Duvalier as symbolic, with no concomitant change in the underlying political structure that has for generations resulted in gross inequities in Haitian society. Only time will tell if representative government and justice can prevail.